Picture this. You're walking down a dark alley at midnight, and suddenly, 30 trained fighters emerge from the shadows, surrounding you in a perfect circle. Their eyes are cold, their fists are clenched, and every single one of them is ready to destroy you. Most people would drop to their knees and beg for mercy. Most people would cry. Most people would never have walked into that alley alone in the first place. But Elena Vasquez is not most people. When those 30 fighters thought they had cornered their prey, they had no idea they were about to witness something that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. They didn't know that this quiet woman in the simple black dress had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. They couldn't have guessed that behind her calm smile lay the heart of a warrior who had already survived the impossible. What happened next would become legend in the underground fighting world. It would be whispered about in training gyms from Tokyo to New York. It would make grown men question everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and the power of a mother's love. This is the true story of the night that changed everything. The night when 30 of the world's most dangerous fighters learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who seems the most harmless. The night when Elena Vasquez proved that some battles are won before the first punch is ever thrown. Are you ready to discover why she walked into that trap alone? Are you prepared to learn what drives a person to face impossible odds without a hint of fear? Then, step into the shadows with Elena and witness the moment when legend was born. Elena Vasquez adjusted the thin silver chain around her neck as she stood before the mirror in her small apartment bathroom. The pendant that hung from it was simple, unremarkable to most people, but, to her, it carried the weight of 15 years of pain, determination, and an unbreakable promise. The tiny engraving on its surface read, "Mama's Little Fighter," in childish handwriting that would forever remind her of the daughter who would never grow up to fix her spelling. The clock on her nightstand showed 11:15 p.m. In 45 minutes, she would walk into the most dangerous situation of her life. She had known this day would come since the morning she buried Sophia, her 8-year-old daughter, whose only crime was being in the wrong place when Marcus, the Iron Fist Rodriguez, decided to settle a score with her father. Elena had been a different woman then. A kindergarten teacher who baked cookies for school fundraisers, and whose biggest worry was whether Sophia would remember to bring her lunch money. She had soft hands that knew how to braid hair and tie shoelaces, not how to break bones and silence heartbeats forever. But grief has a way of reshaping a person, molding them into something they never imagined they could become. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For the first 6 months after Sophia's death, Elena had tried to return to her normal life. She attempted to teach, to smile at other people's children, to pretend that her world hadn't ended in a spray of gunfire outside Roosevelt Elementary School. But every night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, seeing Sophia's face, hearing her laughter, and burning with a rage that threatened to consume her from the inside out. The police had done nothing. Marcus Rodriguez was untouchable, they said. Too well-connected, too careful, too smart to leave evidence. The witnesses had vanished or developed sudden amnesia. The investigating officers spoke in the tired voices of men who had seen too many good people lose everything to monsters who would never face justice. Elena realized that if she wanted Marcus to pay for what he had done, she would have to make it happen herself. That was when she met Thomas Chun, a former Navy SEAL turned underground fighting instructor who ran a gym in the basement of an abandoned warehouse on the east side of the city. Elena had found him through a series of carefully worded internet searches and coded conversations in chat rooms where desperate people sought dangerous solutions to impossible problems. She had walked into his gym with tears still fresh on her cheeks and asked him to teach her how to kill. Thomas had laughed at first, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Elena stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed barely 120 pounds. She had never thrown a punch in anger, never been in a fight more serious than a playground scuffle in 3rd grade. She looked like every suburban mom who had ever asked to speak to a manager, not someone who belonged in a world where violence was currency and mercy was weakness. But something in her eyes had made him stop laughing. There was a darkness there, a cold determination that reminded him of the most dangerous soldiers he had served with. These were people who had made peace with their own mortality, who had decided that their mission mattered more than their survival. Elena had that same quality, that same willingness to sacrifice everything for a single purpose. Thomas agreed to train her, but only after she passed his test. He led her to a heavy bag that hung from the ceiling like a leather-wrapped corpse and handed her a pair of worn boxing gloves. He told her to hit the bag as hard as she could, to show him what she was working with. Elena put on the gloves, stepped up to the bag, and threw a punch that barely made it move. Thomas shook his head and started to walk away. But Elena wasn't finished. She hit the bag again, and again, and again. Her knuckles bled through the gloves. Her shoulders screamed in protest, and her lungs burned with every breath. But she kept hitting, kept pushing, kept fighting through the pain because the pain in her body was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She hit that bag for 3 straight hours, until her arms felt like overcooked spaghetti and her legs could barely hold her upright. When she finally stopped, Thomas was still there, watching her with new respect. He handed her a towel and told her to come back tomorrow. That was the beginning of the most brutal education of Elena's life. For 15 years, Elena learned. She mastered boxing, kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, Krav Maga, and a dozen other fighting disciplines whose names most people had never heard. She studied anatomy until she knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. She practiced with knives until she could find an artery in complete darkness. She learned to shoot pistols, rifles, and crossbows with deadly accuracy. She conditioned her body until she could run 20 miles without breathing hard and break concrete blocks with her bare hands. But, more importantly, she learned patience. Marcus Rodriguez was not just any criminal. He was the head of the largest drug operation in the city, protected by an army of enforcers and a network of corrupt officials that stretched all the way to the mayor's office. He lived in a fortified compound surrounded by security cameras, motion detectors, and armed guards who shot first and never bothered with questions. Getting to him would require more than fighting skills. It would require intelligence, planning, and the kind of strategic thinking that came from years of studying your enemy. Elena became a student of Marcus Rodriguez's life. She learned his routines, his weaknesses, his fears. She discovered that he had a daughter of his own, a girl named Carmen who attended private school and took ballet lessons on Tuesday afternoons. Elena spent months watching Carmen from a distance, not because she had any intention of harming an innocent child, but because she wanted to understand what made Marcus human. She wanted to know what he loved so that when the time came, she could make him understand what it felt like to lose everything. The deeper Elena dug into Marcus's world, the more she realized that simply killing him wouldn't be enough. Marcus was like the head of a hydra, and cutting off one head would only cause 2 more to grow in its place. His organization would survive his death, and some other monster would take his place. The cycle of violence that had claimed Sophia's life would continue, claiming other innocent children whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elena needed to do more than kill Marcus. She needed to destroy his entire operation, scatter his followers to the wind, and send a message that would echo through the criminal underworld for years to come. She needed to become something that monsters would fear, something that would make them think twice before pointing their guns at innocent people. That was when she learned about the Council of 30, Marcus's inner circle of elite fighters who served as his personal bodyguards and enforcers. These weren't street thugs with more muscles than brains. These were professionally trained killers, many of them former military or law enforcement, who had sold their skills to the highest bidder. They were the best of the best, and they were fiercely loyal to Marcus because he paid them more money than they could make anywhere else. The Council of 30 was Marcus's greatest strength, but Elena realized it could also be his greatest weakness. If she could destroy the Council, she could cripple his organization and force him to face her alone. But challenging 30 elite fighters at once seemed like suicide, even for someone with Elena's skills and training. That was when she remembered something Thomas had told her during one of their late-night training sessions. He had been drinking whiskey and talking about his time in the military, sharing stories about impossible missions and the soldiers who had completed them. He told her that the most dangerous warrior wasn't necessarily the one with the best skills or the biggest muscles. It was the one who was willing to do whatever it took to win, no matter the cost. Elena realized that she had an advantage that none of Marcus's fighters could match. They were fighting for money, for reputation, for the thrill of violence. But she was fighting for something much more powerful. She was fighting for justice, for closure, for the memory of a little girl who would never grow up to have children of her own. She was fighting with the kind of desperate love that made mothers lift cars off their trapped children and fathers run into burning buildings to save their families. That love, that absolute commitment to her cause, would be her secret weapon. Marcus's fighters might be stronger, faster, and more experienced, but they had never faced an opponent who literally had nothing left to lose. The plan Elena developed was simple in its audacity. She would challenge the Council of 30 to meet her in single combat, all at once, in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city where Marcus conducted his most sensitive business. She would walk into their trap alone and unarmed, betting everything on the element of surprise and the power of her own carefully cultivated reputation. For the past 5 years, Elena had been building that reputation. She had taken jobs as a freelance problem solver for people who needed problems to disappear permanently. She never asked for money, only information about Marcus's organization. She was careful to only target genuinely evil people, killers, and dealers who preyed on the innocent. But she made sure that each job was performed in a way that would become legendary. There was the time she had eliminated 3 human traffickers by dropping them through the skylight of their warehouse, one by one, over the course of a single night. There was the drug dealer who had been found hanging upside down from a bridge with a note pinned to his chest that read, "Justice for the children." There was the corrupt cop who had simply vanished from his patrol car, leaving behind only his badge and a confession letter detailing decades of crimes. Each of these incidents had been attributed to someone the underworld had started calling the Silent Mother, a phantom assassin who struck without warning and disappeared without a trace. The stories grew in the telling, becoming more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. Some people claimed she could walk through walls. Others insisted she could kill with a touch. Everyone agreed that crossing her was a death sentence. Elena had carefully cultivated this mythology, knowing that fear would be her greatest ally when the time came to face Marcus. She wanted his fighters to be nervous, uncertain, wondering if the stories they had heard were true. She wanted them to second-guess themselves, to hesitate for just a moment when the fighting began. In a battle where the odds were 30-1, a moment's hesitation could be the difference between victory and death. Now, as Elena stood in her bathroom applying tich, the abandoned subway station had been closed to the public for over 20 years, ever since the city had rerouted the lines and left this particular section to rot in the darkness beneath the streets. The entrance was hidden behind a rusted fence in an alley that most people avoided even during daylight hours. By midnight, it was a place where only the most desperate or dangerous souls dared to venture. Elena approached the fence with the measured steps of someone who had walked this path many times in her mind. She had spent weeks studying the layout of these tunnels, memorizing every twist and turn, every hidden passage and dead end. She knew exactly where Marcus's men would position themselves, exactly how they would try to trap her, and exactly how she would turn their own strategy against them. The rusty gate opened with a squeal that echoed through the empty alley like a scream. Elena paused for a moment, listening to the city sounds above her head. Cars honked in distant traffic, a siren wailed somewhere to the north, and the general hum of urban life continued its eternal rhythm. In a few hours, when the sun rose, people would go about their daily routines completely unaware that their world had been changed by what happened in the darkness below their feet. Elena descended the concrete stairs that led into the bowels of the subway system. Her heels clicked against the steps with a sharp staccato that announced her arrival to anyone who might be listening. She wasn't trying to be stealthy. She wanted them to know she was coming. She wanted them to have time to prepare, to position themselves, to feel confident in their overwhelming numerical advantage. The more secure they felt, the more devastating their surprise would be when she revealed what she was truly capable of. The air grew colder as she descended, heavy with the smell of rust, mold, and decades of urban decay. Graffiti covered the walls like the fevered dreams of a dying civilization, layer upon layer of tags and murals that chronicled the hopes and frustrations of countless forgotten souls. Some of the artwork was beautiful, elaborate pieces that transformed the underground wasteland into a subterranean gallery. Other sections were just crude tags and vulgar slogans, the artistic equivalent of screaming into the void. Elena reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself standing on the platform where commuters had once waited for trains that would never come again. The tracks stretched away into darkness in both directions, disappearing into tunnels that seemed to lead straight into the heart of hell itself. Flickering fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling at irregular intervals, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the cracked tile walls. She walked to the edge of the platform and jumped down onto the tracks, her heels echoing through the tunnel like gunshots. The electrified third rail had been dead for decades, but Elena still avoided stepping on it out of habit. Some superstitions died hard, even for people who had made peace with their own mortality. The message had been simple when it arrived 3 days ago. A single text from an unknown number that read, Pier 47 subway station, midnight. Come alone if you want Rodriguez. Elena had known immediately that it was a trap. Marcus's people had finally decided that the silent mother had become too much of a threat to ignore. They were going to eliminate her before she could get close enough to pose a real danger to their boss. What they didn't realize was that this was exactly what Elena had been hoping for. She had spent months leaving carefully placed clues and anonymous tips that would eventually lead Marcus's people to the conclusion that she was planning to make her move soon. She had wanted them to feel threatened enough to act, but not so threatened that they would simply disappear into the shadows and wait for her to make a mistake. The abandoned subway station was perfect for her purposes. The tunnels provided multiple escape routes if things went wrong, but more importantly, they would force Marcus's fighters to spread out in ways that would limit their ability to coordinate their attacks. In an open space like a warehouse or parking garage, 30 fighters could surround her and attack from all directions simultaneously. But in the narrow confines of the subway tunnels, they would have to come at her in smaller groups, and Elena was confident she could handle 5 or 6 opponents at a time. She had also chosen her outfit carefully. The simple black dress she wore looked elegant and feminine, but it was made from a specially designed fabric that would tear away in strategic places if grabbed, and the seemingly delicate heels of her shoes were actually reinforced with steel cores that could shatter bone with a well-placed kick. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo that concealed the sharpened hairpins that were her only weapons, and her purse contained a few additional surprises that Marcus's men would never see coming. Elena walked deeper into the tunnel, her footsteps echoing through the darkness like a funeral march. She could feel eyes watching her from the shadows, could sense the presence of hidden figures positioned at strategic points throughout the underground maze. They were good, she had to admit. If she hadn't spent years studying their methods and preparing for this exact scenario, she might have walked into their trap without realizing how thoroughly she was surrounded. But Elena had learned long ago that the best way to deal with a trap was to walk into it deliberately. When you knew you were walking into an ambush, you could prepare for it, could turn the ambusher's own tactics against them. The element of surprise was a powerful weapon, but it only worked if your opponent wasn't expecting it. She reached the center of the station, where the platform widened into a larger space that had once housed ticket booths and waiting areas. This was where they would make their move. The space was large enough for multiple attackers to engage her simultaneously, but not so large that they could maintain their distance and pick her off from a safe range. It was the perfect killing ground, which was exactly why Elena had suggested it in the coded messages she had left for Marcus's people to find. Elena stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the space, waiting. She checked her watch, 12:03 a.m. They were making her wait, probably hoping to increase her nervousness and give themselves a few extra moments to get into position. It was a basic psychological tactic, and it might have worked on someone who was actually nervous about what was about to happen. But Elena felt nothing except a cold, calm certainty that this was where her journey was always meant to end. She had known since the day Sophia died that her own life was forfeit, that she was living on borrowed time until she could complete her mission. Whether she died tonight or lived to see the sunrise, she had already accomplished more than she had ever dreamed possible. The Silent Mother had become a legend that would outlive Elena Vasquez, and that legend would continue to protect innocent people long after her body had turned to dust. A slow clapping sound echoed through the tunnel, the sharp reports bouncing off the walls and creating an eerie, rhythmic symphony. Elena turned toward the sound and saw a figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the platform. He was a tall, muscular man with graying temples and the kind of confident swagger that came from years of never losing a fight. Elena recognized him immediately from the photographs she had studied. Viktor Kozlov, Marcus's lieutenant and the nominal leader of the Council of 30. The famous Silent Mother, Viktor said, his Russian accent thick as molasses. I must admit, you are not what I expected. When I heard the stories, I pictured someone more intimidating. Elena smiled, the expression cold and predatory. Appearances can be deceiving, Viktor. I'm sure you know that better than most. Other figures began emerging from the shadows, stepping out from behind pillars and alcoves where they had been waiting. Elena counted them as they appeared. 10, 15, 20, 25. Each one was a professional killer, handpicked by Marcus for their skill and loyalty. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, positioning themselves in a loose circle around Elena with the practiced efficiency of a hunting pack. Elena noticed that they were all carrying weapons, knives, brass knuckles, weighted chains, and other instruments of violence that would allow them to inflict maximum damage while minimizing the risk to themselves. They had clearly decided that the Silent Mother was too dangerous to face with bare hands alone. It was a compliment of sorts, even if it wasn't one Elena particularly appreciated. 30 against 1, Elena observed, turning slowly to take in the full circle of killers that surrounded her. Hardly sporting odds, don't you think? Viktor laughed, a sound like grinding glass. Sports are for children, little mother. This is business. You have become a problem for our organization, and problems must be eliminated. Before you eliminate me, Elena said, reaching into her purse with deliberate slowness. Perhaps you would like to see something that might change your perspective. Every weapon in the circle was raised. 30 pairs of eyes focused on Elena's hand as it disappeared into her purse. But instead of producing a gun or knife, she withdrew a small tablet computer and held it up so that Viktor could see the screen. What is that? Viktor demanded, his voice tense with suspicion. Elena smiled and tapped the screen, activating a video feed that showed a familiar scene. Marcus Rodriguez's compound, viewed from multiple security cameras that were supposed to be monitoring the perimeter for threats. But the cameras had been turned around, and instead of watching for intruders, they were now focused on the building's interior. The feed showed Marcus himself, sitting in his office and completely unaware that he was being watched. He was alone, his guards having been dismissed for the evening on the assumption that their boss was perfectly safe, while 30 of his best fighters were dealing with the Silent Mother problem. Elena had spent months learning his routines, and she knew that Marcus always spent Monday nights reviewing financial reports in solitude, trusting his security system to protect him. As we speak, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the underground chamber, my associates are positioning themselves throughout Marcus's compound. The security system has been compromised, the guards have been neutralized, and your boss is sitting alone in his office like a lamb waiting for slaughter. Viktor's face went pale as he processed the implications. You're lying. This is some kind of trick. Elena tapped the screen again, and the view changed to show another part of the compound. Bodies were visible in the corridors, guards who had been silently eliminated by Elena's team. The video was real, and Viktor was experienced enough to recognize genuine surveillance footage when he saw it. You have a choice, Elena continued, her voice still calm and conversational. You can try to kill me here, which will take time and make noise and alert the authorities, guaranteeing that you'll never reach Marcus in time to save him. Or you can let me walk away and rush back to protect your meal ticket, possibly arriving in time to prevent his very messy and public execution. The circle of killers looked to Viktor for direction, their weapons still raised but their confidence clearly shaken. They had been prepared to face a lone woman in an underground tunnel, not to deal with a coordinated attack on their base of operations. Viktor stared at the screen for a long moment, watching as Elena's team moved through the compound like ghosts, eliminating resistance with surgical precision. Finally, he looked up at Elena with something approaching respect in his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. "Really?" Elena reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, letting the elaborate updo collapse and reveal the weapon she had concealed within it. The silver hairpins gleamed in the fluorescent light, their sharpened points reflecting the surrounding illumination like stars. "I'm the mother of Sofia Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of pain and determination. "And I'm here to collect a debt that's long overdue." Victor made his decision. He lowered his weapon and gestured for his men to do the same. The circle of killers stepped back, creating a path for Elena to leave the underground chamber. "This isn't over," Victor warned. "Even if you kill Marcus, his organization will survive. Someone else will take his place, and they will come for you." Elena gathered her hairpins and began pinning them back into her hair, transforming them once again from deadly weapons into innocent accessories. "Let them come," she said. "I've been waiting 15 years for this conversation to end. I can wait a little longer for the next one to begin." Marcus Rodriguez's compound sat like a fortress in the hills overlooking the city, its white walls gleaming in the moonlight like the bones of some ancient predator. Elena parked her motorcycle a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving through the shadows with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using skills learned in preparation for this very moment to infiltrate the home of the man who had taught her the necessity of acquiring them. The compound was impressive, she had to admit. 3 acres of manicured grounds surrounded a main house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful entrepreneurs, not the headquarters of a criminal empire. High walls topped with razor wire enclosed the property, and Elena could see the red dots of laser tripwires crisscrossing the landscaped gardens like a deadly constellation. Security cameras mounted on rotating pods swept back and forth across the grounds, their lenses glinting in the artificial lighting that turned night into an eternal twilight. Elena had studied this place for months, learning every detail of its defenses, every pattern of its security patrols, every weakness that might be exploited by someone determined enough to try. She knew that the walls were equipped with pressure sensors that would detect anyone trying to climb them. She knew that the main gate was protected by bulletproof glass and armed guards who had orders to shoot first and identify bodies later. She knew that the house itself was a maze of reinforced doors, hidden passages, and panic rooms designed to keep Marcus safe even if his outer defenses were breached. What Marcus didn't know was that Elena had been inside his compound before, not as an intruder, but as an invited guest. 6 months ago, she had applied for a job as a tutor for Carmen Rodriguez, Marcus's 14-year-old daughter who was struggling with her mathematics coursework. Elena had created a false identity complete with teaching credentials and glowing references, becoming Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett, a widowed educator with a specialty in helping troubled children. For 3 weeks, Elena had visited the compound twice weekly, teaching Carmen algebra and geometry while secretly memorizing the layout of the house, the positioning of the security cameras, and the routines of the staff. She had been the perfect tutor, patient, and encouraging with a young girl who was clearly struggling with more than just mathematics. Carmen was intelligent, but troubled, aware that her father's wealth came from activities that decent people didn't discuss in polite company. Elena had found herself genuinely liking Carmen despite everything. The girl was nothing like her father, possessing a kindness and innocence that reminded Elena painfully of Sofia at the same age. Carmen talked about wanting to be a veterinarian, about her love for the horses that were kept in the compound's private stables, about her dreams of traveling to places where her last name wouldn't automatically make people afraid or suspicious. It had been during one of these tutoring sessions that Elena had learned about the tunnel. Carmen had mentioned it casually while complaining about the house's confusing layout, explaining that her father had insisted on installing an escape route that connected the main house to the old storm drain system that ran beneath the hills. The tunnel was supposed to be a secret, but Carmen had discovered it years ago during a game of hide and seek with one of the household staff. Elena had filed this information away carefully, knowing that it might prove useful when the time came for her final confrontation with Marcus. But She had also made a mental note to ensure that Carmen was safely away from the compound when that confrontation took place. Whatever sins Marcus had committed, his daughter didn't deserve to witness her father's destruction. Elena had ended her employment as Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett after Carmen's grades improved sufficiently to satisfy Marcus. She had maintained the fiction of the grateful tutor who was sad to see her teaching assignment end, and Marcus had even paid her a bonus for her excellent work. Elena had deposited the money in a scholarship fund for children who had lost parents to gang violence, finding a bitter satisfaction in using Marcus's own money to help the victims of people like him. Now, as Elena crouched in the darkness studying the compound's defenses, she thought about Carmen and wondered if the girl was safe. Elena had made inquiries through her network of contacts and learned that Carmen was attending a boarding school in Switzerland, far from her father's world of violence and crime. The knowledge that Marcus's daughter would be spared the trauma of witnessing what was about to happen was one of the few things that allowed Elena to sleep peacefully at night. Elena moved closer to the compound, staying in the shadows cast by the mature oak trees that lined the property. She had timed her approach for the changing of the guard, a 15-minute window when the security teams would be focused on their handover procedures rather than watching the perimeter. Victor and his men would be racing back from the subway station right about now, probably realizing that they had been tricked but still hoping to arrive in time to save their boss. The storm drain entrance was hidden beneath a decorative grating near the eastern wall of the compound. Elena had located it during her reconnaissance missions and confirmed that it connected to the tunnel system Carmen had mentioned. The grating was locked, but Elena had come prepared with bolt cutters that made quick work of the security chain. She lowered herself into the storm drain and replaced the grating above her head, erasing the evidence of her entry. The tunnel was larger than she had expected, easily wide enough for a person to walk upright, though the smell of stagnant water and decades of urban runoff made breathing an unpleasant experience. Elena activated a small LED flashlight and began following the tunnel toward the main house. The underground passage was older than the compound itself, probably dating back to the 1940s when this area had been developed as suburban housing for the city's growing middle class. The walls were lined with concrete that had cracked and stained over the decades, and Elena could hear the skittering of rats in the darkness beyond her light. But the tunnel was structurally sound, and, more importantly, it was completely outside the range of Marcus's sophisticated security system. Elena walked for 10 minutes before reaching the connection point where the storm drain intersected with Marcus's escape tunnel. The difference in construction quality was immediately obvious. The escape tunnel was newer, wider, and lined with smooth concrete that had been painted with waterproof. She turned and walked toward the tunnel that led back to the surface, her heels clicking against the concrete with the same steady rhythm they had maintained when she arrived. Behind her, she could hear Victor shouting orders to his men, organizing their desperate rush back to Marcus's compound. Elena allowed herself a small smile as she climbed the stairs toward street level. The tablet had been a masterful piece of misdirection, showing genuine security footage from Marcus's compound, but not from tonight. The video had been recorded 3 weeks ago during Elena's reconnaissance mission, and she had simply played it back to create the illusion that an assault was already underway. In reality, Elena had no associates, no team of professional killers to call upon. She had always worked alone, and tonight would be no different. But Victor and his men didn't know that, and by the time they realized the truth, Elena would be long gone, and their boss would be dead. The Council of 30 had just made the classic mistake of splitting their forces, sending most of their strength to defend against a threat that didn't exist, while leaving their primary target vulnerable to an attack they didn't see coming. Elena had used their own loyalty against them, turned their greatest strength into a fatal weakness. As she emerged from the subway entrance into the cool night air, Elena reflected on the irony of the situation. Marcus's men had been so concerned with the legend of the Silent Mother that they had forgotten to consider the possibility that Elena Vasquez, grieving kindergarten teacher, might be far more dangerous than any phantom assassin. Now she had approximately 30 minutes before Victor and his men realized they had been played and came looking for her. 30 minutes to reach Marcus's compound, penetrate his remaining defenses, and complete the mission that had consumed her life for the past 15 years. Elena walked to the motorcycle she had parked 3 blocks away, a sleek black machine that could outrun any pursuit and navigate through traffic that would stop a car cold. She had learned to ride during her years of training, mastering the vehicle not because she enjoyed it, but because it was a tool that might prove useful in her mission. As she started the engine and pulled into the empty street, Elena thought about Sophia and the promise she had made at her daughter's grave. Tonight, that promise would finally be kept. Tonight, justice would be served, no matter what the cost. Last touches of makeup that would disguise the scars Thomas's training had left on her hands and arms. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 15 years of preparation, 15 years of learning to become someone her younger self would not have recognized. She had sacrificed her old life, her old identity, everything that had made her Elena the kindergarten teacher, to become something harder and deadlier. But, as she touched the pendant around her neck, she knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Tonight, she would get justice for Sophia. Tonight, she would make Marcus Rodriguez pay for every child whose life he had destroyed. And, if she died in the process, at least she would die knowing that she had fought for something that mattered. Elena checked her watch again. 11:30 p.m. It was time to go. She picked up the small black purse that contained the only weapons she would carry into battle, a set of silver hairpins that had been sharpened to deadly points, and waited for perfect balance. To anyone who searched her, they would look like innocent accessories. To Elena, they were the tools that would help her dismantle Marcus's empire one fighter at a time. She took one last look around her apartment, knowing she would probably never see it again. The walls were covered with pictures of Sophia, hundreds of images chronicling a short life that had been full of joy and promise. Elena whispered a goodbye to each smiling face, promising her daughter that her death would not be forgotten, would not be meaningless. Then, she turned off the lights, locked the door behind her, and stepped out into the night that would change everything.